I had always been a man who preferred the quiet predictability of life, the rhythm of my work, the small satisfaction of maintaining order in my properties, and the pride that came from owning a piece of land that had been in my family for generations. That sense of control, however, was shattered the moment Karen moved into the neighborhood, bringing with her the kind of entitlement and audacity that seemed almost cinematic in its intensity. From the start, she was a thorn in my side, a woman who wielded her HOA position like a scepter, issuing threats and complaints over the most trivial matters, from the way my lawn was trimmed to the exact placement of my mailbox. I watched with growing incredulity as she escalated her petty grievances, calling neighbors, submitting formal complaints, and eventually contacting local authorities with exaggerated claims that I had violated ordinances I had known like the back of my hand for decades. Her fury reached a new peak when she somehow discovered a minor construction project I had begun on one corner of my property, a project that had been fully permitted and in compliance with every regulation. The sheer audacity of her filing a complaint that portrayed me as a rogue operator, a man who ignored community rules, was laughable and infuriating. Yet what she didn't realize, what none of the neighbors knew, was that I was not just another property owner in the subdivision. I was the landlord, the title holder of the very properties she had arrogantly tried to police, the man who had the ultimate authority over the land she had been so quick to criticize. The irony of her situation was exquisite. She had escalated her petty crusade against me without the faintest idea that I held all the cards. That revelation, however, was mine alone to savor, and I planned to unfold it slowly, deliberately, to let her arrogance crumble under the weight of its own foolishness. Every phone call she made, every email she sent to the HOA board, every frantic knock on my door was an opportunity for me to observe her unravel, to watch as the meticulous persona she cultivated around her social status began to crack. I remember the first time she showed up unannounced, a self-righteous fury in her eyes, expecting me to grovel or apologize, expecting to find a man intimidated by her assertiveness. Instead, I simply opened the door, let her storm inside, and calmly reminded her that I owned the property, that she was, in fact, standing in my house without permission, and that any further harassment could carry serious legal consequences. Her expression froze, a mix of shock, disbelief, and an almost comical realization dawning across her face. In that moment, I felt the satisfaction that only comes from years of dealing with entitlement and arrogance, a sense of poetic justice that was sweeter than any triumph I had experienced in my business dealings. It was not cruelty. It was the balance of power, the restoration of order that she had so carelessly sought to disrupt. I had been patient, measured, and observant, cataloging every overstep, every exaggeration, and every act of sabotage she had attempted, from trying to block my renovations to spreading rumors about my character. And now, with a single statement, the scales had tipped, and the woman who had wielded the HOA as her weapon was rendered silent, frozen in the reality that her assumptions about me were disastrously wrong. After that initial confrontation, the dynamics between Karen and me shifted in ways I could have only imagined in my wildest scenarios, the kind of reversal that makes people question everything they thought they knew about power and authority. She retreated initially, the arrogance in her stride replaced with cautious hesitation, but her attempts to undermine me did not cease entirely. They merely transformed into more subtle, desperate measures. I began noticing changes in how the HOA board responded to her complaints. Suddenly, emails were ignored, meetings rescheduled, and her so-called evidence dismissed as trivial or unfounded. It became clear that once the truth about my ownership was fully recognized, her influence waned rapidly. Meanwhile, I kept meticulous records of every interaction, every attempt she made to challenge my authority, knowing that her desperation would eventually lead her to mistakes, legal oversights, or outright violations that could be leveraged if necessary. Yet I did not seek revenge. I sought control, the kind that comes not from brute force but from strategy, patience, and the unshakable knowledge that one holds the ultimate authority. My daily life returned to a semblance of normalcy, though it was never entirely quiet. There was always the shadow of her presence, a reminder that arrogance and entitlement do not simply vanish. They linger like a storm cloud waiting for a spark. And that spark came one afternoon, when I noticed her tampering with the landscaping near the property boundary, attempting to manipulate what she believed was communal land to gain favor with other neighbors. It was a minor act in the grand scheme of things, but in my eyes, it represented the audacity that had characterized her approach to every aspect of our interactions. I confronted her calmly, my voice even, outlining the exact boundaries of the property, citing documentation, permits, and legal precedent. Her face turned pale, her usual fire dimmed to a flicker of panic. The HOA neighbors who had gathered to witness the confrontation whispered among themselves, their eyes darting between us, sensing the power imbalance, but unable to articulate it. Karen tried to assert her authority, to regain some semblance of dominance, but every word she uttered was met with calm, factual correction, leaving her floundering. By the end of the encounter, it was evident to all present that she had miscalculated catastrophically. The woman who had once wielded the HOA like a sword now had nothing but empty gestures and faltering words. And as I watched her storm off, muttering complaints to herself, a grim satisfaction settled over me. I knew this was only the beginning, the first layer of her unraveling, and I would savor every subsequent misstep as she attempted to navigate the very rules she had once thought she could manipulate with impunity. There was a lesson in all of this, one that involved humility, respect for boundaries, and the undeniable reality that power cannot be assumed. It must be earned or held by legitimate authority. And now, for the first time, Karen was learning that the authority she had so carelessly wielded did not belong to her. It belonged to me. Life after that confrontation with Karen unfolded like a slow-burning storm, each day revealing a new layer of the chaos she had tried to impose on my life and the community, and each day reminding me of the meticulous patience it took to navigate such a tangled web of entitlement and ignorance. I had always believed that power was less about aggression and more about foresight, strategy, and the unwavering ability to anticipate every possible move your adversary could make. And Karen, in her reckless arrogance, had underestimated every facet of my capability. In the weeks that followed, I took deliberate steps to reclaim not just my peace of mind, but the tangible authority I had over every inch of my property and the surrounding land I had nurtured for decades. I began with minor, almost imperceptible improvements, things that would go unnoticed by the untrained eye, but which subtly reinforced my control. Adjusting irrigation systems so that lawns aligned perfectly with property boundaries, installing discrete security cameras to monitor activity without alerting neighbors, and reorganizing access points in ways that optimized both aesthetics and oversight. Karen, of course, noticed these changes, or thought she did, and immediately assumed they were attempts to intimidate her, when in reality they were simple acts of ownership, the natural extension of responsibilities I had carried long before she arrived in the neighborhood with her self-important attitude. The irony of her continued interference only grew more delicious as I observed her growing increasingly frantic, hopping from one HOA meeting to another, waving documents she believed would unseat me or undermine my authority, and speaking with neighbors as though her words alone could shift the legal foundation beneath my feet. In truth, her desperation was a reflection of her ignorance. She had no conception of the contracts, deeds, and historical property records that solidified my claim and empowered me to make any adjustments I saw fit. I watched from a distance, sometimes with amusement, sometimes with a grim recognition of the lengths people will go to when they fail to understand their own limitations, and in each instance, I reminded myself that patience was the ultimate weapon. One particularly vivid day illustrated this lesson better than any other. Karen had organized what she called a neighborhood intervention, a gathering where she intended to rally support against me, presenting her narrative of me as a tyrant, a manipulator, a man who supposedly abused HOA rules for personal gain. The irony was palpable. She was literally attempting to turn the community against their own landlord, unaware that the authority she sought to challenge was embedded in every lease, every deed, and every formal document that proved my legal ownership. I arrived quietly, observing the scene from a discreet vantage point, taking mental notes of the speeches she gave, the exaggerated claims, the falsehoods that dripped from her carefully rehearsed sentences. Her audience, initially captivated by her confident delivery, began to waver as she overreached, claiming powers she simply did not possess, asserting rules that did not exist, and demanding compliance that had no legal or logical basis. By the time I made my entrance, a calm, deliberate presence at the edge of the gathering, the atmosphere had already shifted. Conversations died mid-sentence. Whispers spread like wildfire as the neighbors registered my identity, the realization dawning on Karen's face slower than I would have expected, given the dramatic tension of the moment. She tried to continue, tried to reclaim authority, but the words faltered on her lips, and for the first time, she looked genuinely uncertain. I stepped forward, my voice steady and commanding, but devoid of anger, explaining in precise detail my ownership rights, my role as landlord, the legality of the renovations and improvements I had implemented, and the responsibilities she had arrogantly attempted to usurp. The documentation I carried was thorough, the historical records undeniable, and the clarity of my explanation left little room for doubt or debate. Neighbors who had been unsure of where the truth lay now saw the reality of the situation, and Karen's facade of control crumbled visibly. Her hands trembled slightly, her posture stiffened, and a flush of panic rose across her face as she realized that the very foundation of her campaign was built on assumptions and lies. I did not need to yell or threaten. My presence, my evidence, and the simple truth were enough. Watching her struggle to maintain composure was like witnessing a carefully constructed house of cards collapse under the gentlest breeze. From that day forward, her attempts became increasingly erratic. She would leave passive-aggressive notes on my property, send emails with questionable claims, and attempt to create scenarios where she could assert control, but every move was met with calm, calculated responses, legal clarification, and an unyielding display of authority that reminded her, repeatedly, that she was outmatched. The psychological toll on her was evident, a mixture of disbelief, shame, and growing paranoia. She began to misinterpret casual interactions, assuming hostility where none existed, imagining conspiracies against her that were purely a product of her own actions. I continued my daily routines, unaffected outwardly, yet always aware of her proximity, always prepared for the next attempt at disruption. It was a delicate dance, one that required the perfect balance of vigilance, patience, and subtle intimidation. And yet, even as I exerted control over the tangible aspects of land ownership, I also navigated the intangible elements, community perception, social dynamics, and the intricate web of relationships that define the neighborhood. Karen, in her arrogance, had underestimated the complexity of influence, and every interaction became a lesson in both patience and strategy. I chronicled her every overreach, her every misstep, and her every frantic appeal to the HOA or neighbors, knowing that eventually, the accumulation of evidence would speak louder than any emotional outburst or dramatized complaint. Over time, the pattern became clear. The more she tried to assert power, the more fragile her position became, and the more inevitable her downfall seemed. This was not simply about revenge. It was about restoration, about reclaiming the authority and respect that had been challenged by someone who lacked even the basic understanding of boundaries and responsibility. Every day, I reinforced my control with quiet but undeniable actions, upgrading fencing, improving visibility lines for security, documenting compliance with local regulations, and maintaining meticulous records of all interactions. Each detail, no matter how minor, served as a testament to the truth, a silent message to Karen and anyone else who might attempt similar interference. Power without legitimacy is fleeting, and arrogance is no substitute for knowledge, foresight, or lawful authority. The psychological weight of her awareness began to manifest in increasingly conspicuous ways. Hesitant glances, flustered greetings, abrupt exits from social encounters, and the subtle tremor in her voice when discussing matters related to my property. I observed all of it with a quiet satisfaction, not out of malice, but as a natural acknowledgement of cause and effect. She had sown disruption, and now she was harvesting the consequences of her own actions. In the midst of all this, my own life proceeded as it always had, governed by routines, responsibilities, and the satisfaction of progress. Renovations continued on my property, improvements were implemented with precision, and I maintained an equilibrium that Karen's interference could not disturb. It was a powerful reminder that true authority does not require drama, manipulation, or confrontation. It requires patience, clarity, and an unshakable understanding of one's own position. And so, the story of Karen's unraveling became, in many ways, a lesson in observation, discipline, and the quiet but unassailable strength of rightful ownership. The months that followed were a test of endurance, strategy, and psychological fortitude, a period in which I had to navigate not just the tangible aspects of property ownership, but the subtle, almost imperceptible ways in which Karen's presence threatened the equilibrium of the neighborhood and, by extension, my own sense of order. She continued her efforts to undermine me, but her tactics grew increasingly desperate and, frankly, predictable, as if she were running on autopilot, reacting to each setback without the capacity to formulate a coherent long-term plan. I had learned long ago that people like Karen operate on emotion rather than reason, on impulse rather than calculation, and that knowledge became my greatest asset in what had effectively become a prolonged psychological contest. Every move she made was cataloged, analyzed, and when necessary, countered with quiet precision, never overtly aggressive, but always sufficiently clear to remind her of the reality she refused to accept, that I held the authority, the ownership, and ultimately the control. One particular episode stood out in my memory, an incident that illustrated the depths of her desperation and the precision with which I had learned to manage such situations. It began innocuously enough, with a phone call from a neighbor who reported hearing strange noises near the boundary of my property late at night. Naturally, my initial thought was that it could be an animal or some incidental activity, but upon checking my security footage the next morning, I saw Karen herself, flashlight in hand, attempting to tamper with the fencing I had installed months prior to delineate property lines clearly. Her movements were clumsy, almost theatrical, as if she were performing for an audience she imagined existed but did not. The absurdity of her actions might have been laughable had they not represented a clear act of trespass and potential sabotage. I called the authorities, not in anger, not to incite drama, but to establish an official record of her intrusion. The report was concise, factual, and utterly devoid of exaggeration, a stark contrast to the constant fabrications she had attempted to feed the HOA in prior months. When she learned that a formal complaint had been filed, her reaction was visible even from the camera's angle, a mixture of disbelief, panic, and a dawning recognition that her assumptions about my tolerance for interference were gravely mistaken. Yet, even this did not satisfy the complexity of the situation, because I had to manage not only her actions, but also the social fallout among neighbors who had, over time, begun to watch the ongoing saga unfold with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. I organized a community meeting, ostensibly routine, to clarify property boundaries, responsibilities, and legal obligations, but the real purpose was to demonstrate, calmly and decisively, the legitimacy of my position. Karen attended, predictably, with the air of someone prepared to assert dominance, to sway opinion, and to reassert control. What she encountered instead was methodical clarity, documentation presented in organized binders, historical records of land acquisition, permits, and every conceivable legal reference that established my authority beyond dispute. The tension in the room was palpable, not because I was confrontational, but because the truth has a weight all its own, and Karen could not counter it. Her frustration grew as neighbors began asking questions that highlighted her misunderstandings, her misrepresentations, and, most damningly, her lack of knowledge about the very laws and agreements she had been citing for months. I watched as her confidence eroded visibly, as she stumbled over her own words, grasping for justification that did not exist, and it was in that moment, subtle yet profound, that the true power of patience and preparation became evident. I did not gloat aloud, nor did I berate her. My satisfaction was internal, a recognition that her undoing was not the result of malice, but of careful attention, precise action, and the inescapable reality that authority, grounded in law and evidence, will ultimately prevail over arrogance and presumption. The weeks that followed became a period of observation and minor adjustments, reinforcing security measures, refining property boundaries, and engaging in low-key interactions with neighbors to maintain transparency and trust. Karen, for her part, oscillated between overt attempts to reassert dominance and quiet withdrawal, the inconsistency itself a sign of her internal turmoil. She would approach me directly with complaints, only to retreat when confronted with facts. She would circulate rumors, only to find that neighbors questioned their veracity. She would attempt to manipulate the HOA, only to encounter procedural clarity that rendered her efforts ineffective. In essence, every effort she made to destabilize my authority was transformed into a reinforcement of the very power she sought to challenge. I kept meticulous notes, not out of obsession, but because documentation was a silent but undeniable testament to the truth, a resource I could rely upon in any scenario she might contrive. Beyond the legal and logistical maneuvers, there was also a psychological game at play, one in which observation and restraint were as powerful as confrontation. I noted her body language, her tone of voice, the subtle signs of tension that revealed her inner state even when her words attempted to mask it. Each interaction, whether direct or indirect, became an opportunity to reinforce the balance of power without resorting to theatrics or aggression. By maintaining this composed stance, I not only solidified my authority, but also subtly influenced the perception of those around us, creating an environment where truth, preparation, and law outweighed bluster, intimidation, or petty grievance. It was a long-term strategy, one that required patience, precision, and a refusal to allow emotion to dictate responses. And as the months turned into a year, the cumulative effect became undeniable. Karen's presence, once domineering, became tentative. Her gestures of interference became rare and hesitant. Her attempts at manipulation were met with quiet clarity that reminded her, each time, that she was no longer in control. The transformation was gradual but thorough, a testament to the principle that authority, when grounded in truth and exercised with restraint, cannot be undone by those who operate on impulse and entitlement alone. I continued to oversee property improvements, community relations, and legal compliance with unwavering focus, allowing Karen's failures to serve as a silent reinforcement of the order I maintained. And in quiet moments, I reflected on the lesson embedded in this prolonged encounter, that patience, preparation, and an unshakable commitment to truth are more powerful than confrontation, more enduring than anger, and more satisfying than any immediate victory could ever be. Over time, I witnessed a change not only in Karen's behavior, but in the perception of those around us. Neighbors who had once entertained her complaints now recognized the depth of her misjudgment. The HOA board became more cautious, understanding that claims against me required scrutiny and evidence. And Karen herself began to shrink into the background, her voice less confident, her gestures less commanding, and her attempts at influence increasingly transparent. By carefully balancing authority with restraint, by allowing the consequences of her own actions to unfold naturally, I had transformed what could have been a chaotic, confrontational scenario into a demonstration of order, logic, and the undeniable weight of rightful ownership. Each day, each interaction, and each quiet observation reinforced a simple truth. Power exercised without legitimacy is fleeting, while authority grounded in knowledge, preparation, and legality endures. And as I moved through my days, managing property, overseeing improvements, and maintaining the balance of the community, I did so with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had not only survived a test of patience and intelligence, but had emerged with control reaffirmed, authority unquestioned, and a clear understanding of the profound effectiveness of restraint over rashness and preparation over assumption. By the time the situation with Karen reached its ultimate conclusion, the lessons and experiences of the previous months had crystallized into a deep understanding of human behavior, the dynamics of authority, and the delicate balance between patience and assertiveness. The woman who had once stormed into my life with an aura of self-importance, convinced that she could manipulate, control, and undermine, was now a shadow of her former bravado, moving through the neighborhood with caution, a trace of uncertainty in every gesture and word. It was not revenge that had brought about this transformation, but the consistent application of strategy, observation, and unshakable commitment to truth and legality. My own life, once threatened by her unchecked ambition and audacity, had returned to a rhythm of stability, yet it was a stability enriched with experience, reinforced by vigilance, and tempered by an understanding of the subtle, persistent ways that human arrogance can manifest. Each interaction, each minor confrontation, and each calculated response had contributed to a broader pattern of reinforcement, where the consequences of actions were allowed to unfold naturally, without the need for theatrics, confrontation, or unnecessary escalation. I had discovered that true authority is not displayed through shouting, intimidation, or immediate domination, but through the quiet, relentless consistency of preparation, knowledge, and calm execution. Karen's attempts to manipulate neighbors, to distort facts, or to present herself as a figure of influence were now met with polite but firm corrections, reminders of legal boundaries, and, most importantly, the undeniable presence of documentation, history, and clear evidence that left no room for doubt. There were moments when she would attempt subtle intimidation, such as lingering at community gatherings, sending pointed emails, or whispering to neighbors, but the impact of these actions had been neutralized by the repeated exposure of truth, the reliability of records, and the collective awareness that authority, without legitimacy, is fleeting. I took careful note of each of these instances, not out of obsession, but as a form of study, a meticulous record of cause and effect, a testament to the patterns of behavior that reveal the inner workings of entitlement, fear, and desperation. As the months continued, the balance in the neighborhood shifted decisively. The social dynamics that had once given Karen an imagined power now reflected her diminished influence, a tangible and visible realignment that reinforced the natural order of authority and respect. I maintained my responsibilities with diligence, overseeing renovations, managing property boundaries, attending to legal compliance, and engaging with neighbors with transparency and integrity. Each action, mundane though it might appear, served as a reinforcement of the legitimacy and stability that Karen had sought to disrupt. The satisfaction I derived from these efforts was not rooted in cruelty or vindictiveness, but in the reaffirmation of a principle I had long held, that preparation, knowledge, and patience will always outweigh impulsive aggression and entitlement. The psychological impact on Karen was evident, subtle yet pervasive. Her once confident demeanor had given way to hesitation, her communications carried a trace of uncertainty, and her once commanding presence had faded into a cautious, almost furtive, approach to interactions. She began to avoid direct confrontations. Her attempts at influence became indirect and less frequent, and over time, she receded into a background role, her energy consumed by the awareness that she had misjudged the scope of her authority and the reach of my control. This gradual transformation was more satisfying than any immediate confrontation or public humiliation could have been, because it reflected the natural consequences of her own actions, the inescapable outcomes of her arrogance and assumption that she could operate without accountability. In the quiet moments of reflection, I considered the broader implications of the experience, the importance of understanding not just the legal and logistical dimensions of authority, but also the psychological and social factors that govern human interaction, the necessity of patience in the face of provocation, and the power of knowledge, documentation, and consistent action to neutralize even the most aggressive attempts at interference. My own confidence, patience, and strategic thinking had been tested repeatedly, yet each challenge had reinforced the value of composure, preparation, and measured response. I observed the community with a sense of calm assurance, aware that the patterns I had identified in Karen's behavior could be applied to any similar situation in the future, that the lessons learned here were not confined to a single individual, but reflected universal truths about power, influence, and human nature. Over time, the neighborhood stabilized further. The HOA board operated with more diligence. Neighbors respected boundaries more consistently, and Karen, though still present, became a minor footnote in the ongoing life of the community. The sense of accomplishment I felt was quiet but profound, derived not from conflict, but from the reinforcement of order, the affirmation of truth, and the restoration of balance that had been challenged by unchecked entitlement. I continued to manage my properties with care, overseeing improvements, maintaining records, and interacting with the community with transparency and fairness, ensuring that the foundations of authority, respect, and legality were unshakable. And though Karen's presence remained, a lingering reminder of the audacity people can display when they assume power without understanding, her influence was neutralized, her attempts at disruption contained, and her arrogance tempered by the reality that true authority cannot be feigned, cannot be assumed, and cannot endure without legitimacy. In the end, the entire episode became a testament to the principles I had long valued: patience, preparation, knowledge, and measured action. The woman who had once tried to sabotage my life, to manipulate neighbors, and to challenge my authority had been confronted not with aggression, but with the quiet, relentless certainty of rightful ownership and unassailable truth. I had emerged from the experience not only with my property, control, and authority intact, but with a deeper understanding of human nature, the dynamics of influence, and the enduring power of strategic patience. Karen had learned, finally, the hard way, that assumptions, arrogance, and entitlement are no match for preparation, clarity, and law. And as I moved forward, continuing to oversee my land, my properties, and my community, I did so with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had weathered conflict, preserved order, and affirmed the fundamental principle that power exercised without legitimacy is fleeting, while authority grounded in knowledge, preparation, and law endures indefinitely, unshakable and absolute, no matter the challenges or disruptions that may arise.